With needles in hand, we spin through the air, knitting threads of love with utmost care. Colors and patterns in a dance they twirl, weaving wands warm the world.
Howdy, Daydreamer, and welcome to Weaving Wands, Episode 6. I'm Dakota, and today I've got some really exciting projects to share. I got some new yarn today, but this yarn is a little bit different than any other yarn in a couple of ways. First, it is super, super soft. Like, so soft that I started rolling it into a ball before I remembered to set it down for a second so I could take a picture. Super, super soft. Also, in addition to variegating in colors, and for some reason in this picture it kind of captured high pink, but it's very purpley mulberry toned throughout. And there's not actually any white. I think my flash was on. It's got like a mulberry variegation through it. But also, I think it may be hand spun because it's got variegations in width as well with the color, and the parts where the color's darker are generally thicker throughout. But also, this yarn is very special because it already was donated to a specific charity, and it's just come to me to be knitted into a shape so that it can be sent back to that charity. And that charity is Project Legacy Shawls, which collects charity shawls and lap gowns for patients undergoing end-of-life care in Roanoke, Virginia. And honestly, I felt like this might be a healing charity for me to participate in. Um, because it was things very similar to this that were there for people important to me when I couldn't be. And it's kind of a way I could pay that forward. And the lady who runs it, Miss Diane, was nice enough to allow me to collect some of their donated yarn so that I could shape it and send it on. So I had to find the right pattern. And I always put a lot of thought into the patterns. So I started scrolling and looking, and I found a picture I really liked. And it was for this shawl, which I'll link in the description, by Stephen West. And I really like the concept of it. But with the variegations in this yarn, I kind of think it would be cool to kind of give each section a little more space than the previous section. And I might do something different than a standard like garter tab to start it. Because I kind of have an idea, and having the neck of it roll just a little bit might make it a little bit easier to denote, oh, that's where the collar of it is, and just pick it up and pull it on, if that makes sense. So whenever I have multiples of any matching yarn, I always roll them into one ball together. I'm not quite sure why, but it's just kind of the one thing that I've always just done with yarn that matches, because I've always figured if there's a project where I really need to separate it, I can roll another ball off of it, but it's harder to keep track of what matches what if it's not together, you know? And I've got a shawl started, but I'm still not totally positive on the design, like, I'm pretty sure, and I don't know. But so far what I have going is like a moss stitching on the edge with mostly stockinette, like pure knit, and then a row thrown across to kind of control the curling into shaping. Because anytime you knit in like large chunks of solid stockinette, the fabric's going to be compelled to curl. But one thing that kind of feels magical so far with this yarn is that the way the sizes change between the rows, it's kind of making it springy. I don't know how to describe it, but I cannot stop working on this one. Like the yarn's too soft and it's making too soft of a fabric to put down. But I just went to go do dishes and noticed I don't have any more sponges. But when my partner took me to go pick up some yarn for the yarn craft order they placed, we also grabbed a ball of the scrubby yarn. So I think I'm gonna try to make my own scrubby sponge. And I've grabbed my 3 3/4, like 3.75 millimeter knitting needles. And I honestly forgot to look up the conversion on that, but 3.75 millimeters, whatever that converts to, is what I'm using. And it's, I think, the Red Heart Scrubby, but again, I rolled it on a day I was stressed and the label went somewhere. So first, I'm gonna make my starting glue. And honestly, I think there's as many right ways to make a starting glue as there are people who knit. Because not every method's gonna work for everybody, but everybody kind of starts to develop their own method after they do it a few times. Because I know for a fact I'm not making the same kind of starting loop I did when I started. Because I used to have to use my whole hand to get, a stable loop going. And now I've got it to where I can just loop it around a finger, pull the tail through, slide it on the needle, and pull snug. It's just a bit of practice and keep tryativeness, if that makes sense. And then to cast on, I'm honestly not even gonna count the stitches. I'm just gonna try to match the width of like the bottom of my hand, because that's usually how I try to pick sponges. So instead of having a sponge and having to cut it, I can just make my own and just customize it to size. Now, at this stage, I do recommend going about 2 to 4 stitches over the actual size you're wanting it to come out at, because generally it kind of tightens up from the cast on row a little bit as you work on the fabric. But what I'm gonna do for this one is I'm gonna slip the first stitch on each row and I'm just going to purl back and then knit back. So every odd row I'm gonna knit and then every even row I'm gonna purl. Trying to get a tight weave like this with a fuzzy fabric is gonna get a little bit challenging because some of these little loopy scrubby bits are gonna try to impersonate stitches at some point. But doing just a simple garter stitch back and forth should help minimize the struggle on that and also kind of generate an additional layer of scrubby texture into the scrubby. And then I'm one of those people that always tries to cut the sponges in half. And it's not just to make them last longer, it's also to make it easier to manage with my hand size. So my general recommendation on length is going to be roughly the length of your pointer finger, like index finger, because generally that's going to be the hand, like the part of the hand that's doing the most work during dishes. So as long as it's long enough for your guide fingers to operate, that's generally the length I'd go to for something like this. And for the cast off, I'm making sure I'm on a row where I would knit, and then just casting off with the yarn in front like I'm doing knit stitches, but looping it over so the working needle only has 2 stitches at any given time. And from there, it's really just weaving in the tails. And honestly, even with filming this, I did this in an hour, under an hour, and I didn't check the time until after I did the dishes, which granted wasn't much dishes, but still. So I'm gonna go ahead and dub this the hour or less scrubby. And I do slip the stitch still on the cast off row if I'm doing something like this that has like slip stitches up the sides, because I feel like it makes the corners match with the woven in corners just a little bit more. And it helps keep the corners a little bit more rounded and even, unless you've left all of the corners unslipped, if that makes sense. So I decided to make this at like 4:59 in the afternoon, and then I was done washing dishes by 5:47. So hour or less scrubbing, and I think I'm gonna try to write out like a super detailed pattern for it. And today I was thinking about picking up the placemat to work on it, and I got started, and the yarn wouldn't go down the knitting needle for some reason, and I checked it out and it's cracked. But on the bright side, I do have some circulars that are the same size. So I can just move it over, and it'll probably be a lot easier on my wrists because cotton starts to get heavy after about 6 inches of just straight cotton fabric. And I know I'm always tempted to try and pick it up from where I was working on it. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and just show y'all what happens if you do this. Because what you're supposed to do is pick one end or the other, pick up the project, and then slide it around on the circulars until it's in the right spot. But if you start from where you're working, you're gonna end up with something a bit more like this. Because when you start from where you're working, it ends up flipping the project around on you so that you have like a needle and a tail facing each other, and it's not like you can't knit on the cable. So what you have to do is start from one end or the other and work it across. And it's okay if you've picked it up like this. All it means is you might have to set the project in timeout for a minute so that the tensions settle back down through the fabric. And that's just if you have like a similar form of whatever I've got going on where it has to look just so while you're working on it. Because also, this is cotton. It's gonna mostly settle down, like especially this material and at like a worsted weight, a lot will heal in the wash. And most cotton can be laundered normally. So even if the tension gets a little wonky from it getting twisted up and having to be re-straightened out, that's okay. And then once you reach the part where you've gotten to the cable again, go ahead and grab either the least cracked or uncracked of the knitting needles you were using previously, to move it back onto just to hold it for a second so that we can straighten it out and get it in line. And then we take those stitches off the straight needle and pass them back onto this needle. And then we have it on the circulars straight. Now, what you could also do, since these needles are the same size, and I just didn't think of it until editing, is you could continue working from that point and have the yarn be like already in line for that. But honestly, I just kind of turned a mistake into a teachable moment, and I was a little bit stressed because it does get confusing trying to pick up from straight needles onto circulars sometimes. And honestly, I think the quickest and easiest way is to try to get all of the stitches onto, like, just passed over to the uncracked needle and then move to the circulars for just the fastest way. And if I had done that from the beginning, I probably would have knitted it onto the circulars. But those are thoughts for next time. For this time, I'm just gonna pass the stitches, I just bring the circular around and pass the stitches from this end back over and work my way over to where I left the yarn. And then probably work a handful of stitches after that just to move where the tension point is. Because while it doesn't look like that affected the tension of the yarn like visually at all, the texture is a little off. And if you're also sensitive to things like that, I have found just setting the project down for a day or so generally gives the yarn enough time to like fluff back up into where it's supposed to be for the pattern so that the pattern actually feels right while you're working. And one reason I can be so sensitive to that is because a lot of times I will memorize the pattern and then work it by touch while I'm watching something. So it's kind of important that everything feels like the stitch it is, you know? And while that project's settling, what I'm probably going to do is work on my Project Legacy shawl because this yarn's super soft and also a little bit of a mystery because it was donated without the label. So I received it with no label, and by touch and the fact there was a tiny, tiny little shred of hay, like, woven into the very end of one of the yarn pieces, I am pretty sure that it's wool, but I've worked with a wool before, and it was quite a bit springier, and with how sort of limp this one acts, I kind of think that it may be a superwash. Now, what I'm probably gonna do is finish the shawl and then make a little test thing, maybe a comfort cloth, um, and make it to be like 10 by 10 so that if it shrinks, it's still like, a good size felted one, but laundry test that before trying to wash the whole shawl. But so far, what I've done is cast on 13 stitches and place markers at 3 for the borders on each side, 3 to start the wing on each side, and then 1 to be the slip stitch in the middle. And then running the slip stitch down the middle is kind of giving the purl rows sort of the almost chevron effect across it, so it looks like they're arrowing. And what I've been doing to space them is kind of judging by how straight or arrowed it still is at the center point with the slip stitch. And once it starts doing the arrow thing when I'm on the slip stitch, I start getting ready to do a purl row back across. Because I like the way the colors kind of pool between them and create like a faux stripes through it. And I want to give those like more space to pool and play with the colors as it gets longer. Now this yarn is very stretchy, so I have to be really careful with my tension because if it stretches really far, it thins out before it just like pulls off the ball. So sometimes I have to stop and like pull it to make sure I'm not stretching it too thin. But even so, the size of it does change throughout the ball. The really, really dark parts can be almost sport weight, like just about slightly thicker than there's actually a little bit of it that was right between a red heart and the Bernay baby blank or Bernay baby yarn sport weight one, excuse me. Um and then it gets super, super narrow in some places as well. And I think the thinnest part I've seen I would compare to honestly, I'm not sure. Almost not like a true lace weight, but it does look very lace-y weight next to the rest of it. But what's interesting is that's kind of given the fabric almost anti-bunching effect to it because the size between each row being differentiated like that kind of adds bounciness and elasticity to the fabric. And it's kind of hard to balance that on purpose, but it's balancing automatically from how this yarn is. And it's really cool to work with. It's kind of why I can't seem to get this one to stay out of my hands. And because this yarn goes through mostly like a mulberry purple shades, I didn't want to make it too lacy. Like I wanted to try to keep it more neutral. So I'm trying to do make one increases instead of yarn overs. And for those, you just pick up one of the bars of thread between stitches onto the needles and then knit that as if it was just a previous row's yarn over, if that makes sense. And what that's supposed to do is give you like a no holes increase. What I have is like a small holes increase, and what I think is going on is I need to go inward another stitch to actually do that in the future. Because I think it's beside the moss stitching and it has the stitches alternating between purl and knit, and I think it does the no holes on like in the stockingette panel, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna try that out next time I do make one increases on something. And what gets a little bit more challenging is trying to do that on both sides of a slip stitch. But I do it like this. Now, I think my main challenge currently is that the shape of my stitch marker is kind of getting in my way when I try to grab the bars between the stitches. But you just pick it up and then knit it like it was just in line. Pass a marker, pass the slip stitch, pass the other marker, and then do it again. And it starts to feel a little bit chaotic sometimes, but it is just one slip stitch down the middle. and it is helping me keep track of, like, where the longest point of it is for when I wanna check length, which I honestly haven't done yet, because I don't want to even measure it until I actually see that the ball of yarn has gotten visibly smaller, and I honestly feel like this yarn is magical at this point because the size of the yarn ball has yet to visibly change, even though it looks like this much already on the needles. And this week, I'd like to introduce yarn plan for like a final bit to weaving wands to kind of give myself an outline partially of what I plan to be working on and focusing on throughout the next week, and also let y'all know and have honest some accountability, some questions on, oh, you mentioned this in yarn plan. Did you forget about it? Because y'all, I got ADHD. Help. Okay, so it's not officially diagnosed ADHD, but I'm like 85 to 90% sure. Plus, maybe we could even turn it into a challenge, do like a hashtag yarn plan to kind of share what we're doing with each other and, I don't know, challenge each other to actually complete our yarn plans, if that makes sense. Y'all with me? My yarn plan for the next week is to finish one of those magic hats because I can tell it's going to be one of those patterns that once I get the first one out, the rest are just going to be like popcorn because there's just the ribbing pattern for the brim and then the stitch pattern that the designer made for the hat part. So all I have to do is get over that transition and start making them, you know? And then I'd also like to finish the second placemat and then determine some sort of final length on the project legacy shown because I'm just kind of working on it as it goes. And I haven't really picked a final length for it. I'm probably going to see if it'll go to the maximum length with how the yarn ball's acting super magical and just see how big the wings get. Might have to like keep an eye on how long those are getting to keep those in like a maximum width. Double check that and see what the final length on that's going to be. And then I have to determine the path of the tween shawl because honestly, I'm thinking about frogging the entire one I have right now and starting over in a different yarn weight and doing a slightly different pattern because I had an idea, fell asleep thinking about the idea, and then I had a dream. When I woke up from the dream, I was very upset to find I did not actually knit that thing or film it. It was all a dream. So I'm gonna try to actually make the version of it that I saw in that in the next couple weeks at least, but I have to figure out if I'm still finishing the one I started or if I'm re-rolling that and saving it for another project. We'll find out. And as always, thank you all so much for dreaming with me. Every daydreamer on this journey is so appreciated, and please leave a comment down below so I can say hello. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep your head in the clouds.
Scarves and mittens born from string, they hold the warmth of songs we sing. Through the yarn, life stories are pearled, crafting magic to heal the world. Wrap them tight